Kanye West, Elon Musk, are they just born geniuses or are they on the spectrum?
People who are on the autism spectrum have an extremely active default mode network. 70 to 90% of ADHD comes from genetics.
Naval Ravikant, he talked about giving his kids unlimited freedom.
Sounds a terrible idea to me.
How dangerous is the phone?
I have seen kids with severe technology addiction, and those kids behave in the same way that a meth addict does.
What's your thoughts with, say, religion and mental health?
When we are able to connect with something bigger than us, it has a tremendously powerful impact on our mental health.
Childhood trauma. I openly talk about, I used to crave my dad's attention when I was young. I felt ostracized and unseen in high school.
Well, I think the fact that you're talking about it is huge. Trauma and stress have to find a way out of the body. Hey, Andy.
How are you?
Well. How are you, Andy? We finally connect.
I know. I'm grateful to be alive.
Same.
How was the fires? Did everything work out okay? Was okay?
Yeah, it ended up working out. It was dicey for a while. We were evacuated for just about a week. We ended up staying away from the home for closer to 3 weeks because of the air conditions, but we're back in our home now, and thankfully everything is safe. Yeah. So thank you for asking.
Awesome. Do you have to go, does everyone have to cover their own accommodation fees? What if someone couldn't afford accommodation for 3 months? What would happen then?
Great question. Yeah. Well, we did 3 weeks, but there was FEMA funding for housing, so you could request it, and then the government would put you up in some place. We looked into that option, but the places, that they were offering we ended up staying with families. Yeah.
Do you prefer Stephen, Doctor Storage? Any preference?
Doesn't make much of a difference to me.
Awesome, Stephen. I guess how I first came about you, I think I was initially going through Instagram. I saw one of your partners, the one at the clinic that you work with. I forgot his name.
Amen.
Eamon, that's right, Dr. Eamon. And then I think I reached out to his team and I learned about you, how you're one of the physicians at his clinic. And that's how I came about you. And I love psychology. So I'm glad and grateful to have you on today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to be on.
Awesome. So, Stephen, I guess, yeah, what has been your main focus over the last 6 months? I know going through your Instagram content, you're quite active on social. A lot of your clips, you talk about sort of mental health for children. Is that your sort of main focus?
Well, I'm a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist, so I focus on mental health across the spectrum, but then also really linking mental health back to brain health. So the philosophy of our clinic is that mental health conditions are brain health conditions. And if we can work to optimize the health of someone's brain, ultimately mental health follows. So, the traditional model of psychiatry is symptom based, right? You have these symptoms, you get a diagnosis, you get a medication. We're trying to go a little bit deeper than that.
Got it. And I guess, how does your method different from the diagnosis, medication? What do you guys do differently?
So one is we give time to our patients, right? So we actually, as opposed to the standard visit, at least in the US, it might be a 15-minute visit. And somehow by the end of that visit, the physician is supposed to come up with a accurate diagnosis and treatment plan. So usually that ends up being rushed, and usually it ends up being a medication. So our initial assessments are closer to about 4 hours long. We do neuropsychological testing, so we try to get objective data. And then a big part of our practice is actually looking at the organ that we treat. So if you think about it, psychiatry is the only field in medicine that doesn't look at the organ that they treat, right? If you go to a cardiologist, they're going to look at your heart. Gastroenterologist might do a colonoscopy, but a psychiatrist is usually only talking. And so what we do is in addition to the talking, we also do imaging of the brain. And the type of imaging we use is called SPECT, SPECT. Stands for single photon emission computed tomography. But the thing to know about it is it's a scan that looks at blood flow in the brain. So it helps us determine in a given individual where the blood's going. And blood flow tells you about activity level. So if there's an area of the brain that has very high blood flow, it's a high activity area. Low blood flow, low activity. And so based on those signatures, we get biological data to help us better understand why someone's brain is working the way it is.
Interesting. So, if someone comes to you and they say they're depressed, when you go ahead and do that analysis, biologically, what does their brain look like? Is the flow high? Is the flow low?
Beautiful question. And the answer to that is why we do the scans, because you can have the symptom of depression for a variety of underlying reasons, right? Someone with depression might have a region of the brain known as the thalamus, deep inside the brain, overly active, right? And that would be a classic example of someone with depression. Another might have a signature that shows reduced blood flow along the surface of the brain. We call it scalloping. And that tends to be due to things like toxic exposures, inflammation, mold, these types of factors. And you wouldn't know the difference just by talking to someone because they're going to tell you, I feel tired, I feel depressed, I'm less motivated, I can't really get out of bed, I'm sleeping all day, I'm eating more or I'm eating less. And if you just go off a symptom checklist, the conclusion is you're depressed, and here's your antidepressant, right? But when you actually look at the root cause, you might be going a different route. You might be thinking, wow, why does your brain look so unhealthy? What is it that's driving that?
Interesting. So, when someone comes to you and you do that analysis on the brain, and then you see reduced blood flow or you see hyperactivity, one, what's the catalyst that caused that? And two, what's then the solution?
Absolutely. So root cause is what we're after. Ultimately, we're not after band-aid solutions, right? So if you have an individual where you see a toxic looking brain, the question is, where did the toxicity come from? Is this substance use? Is this an environmental toxin? Is this a head injury? Is this something in the diet? Is this something in their drinking water? You have to do a little bit of digging to figure out what the root cause is, and ultimately reverse it, repair it, help eliminate whatever the toxic exposure is. And if it's depression due to something like an overactive thalamus, you think, what are the factors that's driving that person to become depressed? We think of people as really having four spheres of wellness, right? There's a biological sphere. So things like toxic exposures, things like genetics, family history, these biological factors. You think of psychological well-being. How is someone's ego constructed? What are the things that they've been through that shape them psychologically into who they are today? You think about the social sphere. What do these persons' relationships look like, and how are they interacting with those around them? And then also spiritual, and spirituality doesn't have to mean religion. It means connecting with something bigger than yourself. So when we're doing these assessments, we're thinking about all four spheres. And if there's imbalance in any one of those areas, the brain is not in balance.
Interesting. And how common is the depression or the problem from just being on Netflix all day, doom scrolling through your phone? Because a lot of these depressed homebodies, they're these people that are stuck at home. They're not doing drugs. They're not drinking alcohol. They're not out bumping their heads around, but they're all depressed.
The technology piece is huge. And I work a lot with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is on the rise in terms of both diagnosis and also severity. And a big reason for that is technology. Technology today is evolving much faster than our brains can evolve. And the type of content that we're consuming is fast-paced, and it's designed for rapid dopamine hits. So I'm not anti-social media. I post on social media, but I do think that if unchecked, social media presents a real problem for the human brain. Because as we're scrolling and we're moving from one story to the next, each time we get just a little hit of dopamine. And soon you dump your dopamine, right? The goal with dopamine regulation in the brain is to slowly drip it over the course of the day. But when you're scrolling through social media, you're dumping that dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's involved in things like focus, like reward, pleasure, happiness. If you're dumping it all into your phone, you don't have much left for other things in the day. And suddenly, going for a walk is less interesting. Food is less interesting. Having a conversation is less interesting. Applying ourselves towards a larger purpose or goal feels less interesting because we've already dumped our dopamine.
Interesting. So for people like, say, Kanye West, Elon Musk, Nikola Teslas, are they just born genetically geniuses, or are they on the spectrum? Or is there a root cause? You know, they're partying too much, they're reading too much, they have too much stress. What causes them to be who they are?
That's a great question. Elon Musk has spoken very openly about being on the autism spectrum. And and the autism spectrum is a very wide spectrum, depending on how you define it. It can range from an individual who has limited verbal capacity or even reduced intellectual capacity to someone like Elon Musk. And although autism spectrum is defined as a disorder, I don't necessarily view it that way. I truly think that autism, like ADHD, is a different way of being wired. And the autistic brain is capable of things that a neurotypical brain may not be. And when you look at brains of people who are on the autism spectrum, they actually fire differently. I've seen thousands of brain scans, including hundreds of people on the autism spectrum. And one difference that you tend to see is increased activity in a part of the brain called the default mode network in those individuals who have autism. The default mode network is an area of the brain in the back, sort of, in the back, above. I don't know how to best describe it, but above the cerebellum in the brain. So essentially back top of the head. And that region of the brain is like the brain's third eye. It is responsible for self-awareness. It is responsible for introspection, thinking about things, being in our own head. And people who are on the autism spectrum have an extremely active default mode network. And if you think of that as horsepower in the brain, it sort of may help explain why their brains are wired differently and they're capable of things that others may not be.
Interesting. So I recently had a cousin move to Australia. He's 8 years old, and upon meeting him, he's running around. He's coming to my house. He's opening up the fridge, running into my room, opening boxes that he shouldn't open. How do I know if he's genetically born with, let's say, ADHD, or if he's on the iPad and the phone all the time and that has rewired his brain and it's a root cause problem versus a genetic problem?
Well, what's interesting about ADHD is that 70 to 90% of ADHD comes from genetics. So there's this concept called heritability. Heritability ranges from 0 to 1. 1 means it's 100% genetic. 0 means genetics have nothing to do with it. And for ADHD, the heritability score is between zero 0.7 and zero 0.9. So if a child has symptoms of ADHD and they've been diagnosed with ADHD, you can bet that at least one parent or the other probably has ADHD. And almost certainly there's a first degree relative somewhere that has ADHD. But 70 to 90% is not 100%. So there are other factors that influence ADHD symptoms, one of which is technology, and that's something relatively new in terms of how it's affecting our brains. Another is nutrition. This is a huge problem in the US. So many of our foods are loaded with refined sugars and gluten and processed foods, artificial dyes. The common denominator of all those foods are that they increase inflammation in the brain. And inflammation does two things to blood flow in the brain. It takes areas that are quiet, have reduced blood flow, and makes them more quiet. And it takes areas that are loud, increased blood flow, and makes them louder. So essentially, any sort of deviation in blood flow is exacerbated by inflammation, which nutrition is a huge cause of, especially in kids.
Wow. So when someone has, an issue, whether it's mood swings, depression, anger, how do you know if, or how do we determine if it's a genetic problem or it's a root cause problem and they're getting it because of phone usage, diet, porn, drugs? How do you know what it is?
I think you factor all of the above in at the same time. So if I see a child who has, let's use the example of ADHD, certainly genetics could be at play, but I can't change their genetics, right? What I can change is anything that's influencing those genetics to negatively impact how that child is functioning. So we're going to do a deep dive into all those spheres, right? We're going to look at nutrition. We're going to look at technology use. We're going to look at exercise, at sleep hygiene. We're going to look at supplementation, vitamin levels, and we're going to optimize the heck out of that person's brain, not to cure ADHD, because as I said earlier, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, similar to autism spectrum, is a different way of being wired, and there are strengths that come with it. With ADHD, the strengths are the ability to hyper-focus better than anyone else in the world when you're interested in something, or the ability to be creative, the ability to think about unique solutions to problems. So we're not trying to eliminate those strengths. Really, what we're trying to do is help an individual modulate those strengths to the best of their abilities and know how to mitigate any vulnerabilities. And so that's really the goal. It's not to eliminate ADHD. ADHD exists for a reason. There are evolutionary theories as to why ADHD exists. If you think about human beings in primitive days, the person with ADHD in a tribe is probably the person who is scanning the environment and is able to identify the tiger before the tiger attacks the village, right? The person with ADHD is probably the person who, on a hunt, becomes so hyper-focused and dopamine seeking that they don't come back until they kill an animal. So evolutionary advantage. Fast forward to modern day, and we're expecting people to sit at a desk, on a computer, in a very different environment than what humankind has evolved in. And so there are challenges now that maybe wouldn't have been challenges back then. So another part of ADHD is find the right environment, right? So for me, I talk to people all day, right? And I get to meet very interesting people. I get to try to think creatively about how to help someone optimize the health of their brain. And no two brains are the same. So there's so much problem solving and creativity that goes into my job. And I myself have ADHD. So it keeps me very stimulated, right? But if I were to have to sit at a desk and crunch numbers all day, my brain would not thrive in that environment. Someone else's might, but mine wouldn't. So part of ADHD is also finding the environment where your brain thrives and going for it.
So like yesterday I had like a long work day. It was like 11 hours. I had like a 2 hour podcast. I had like two 1 hour sales calls. I had a last minute consulting call from a client that really needed help quickly. And by the end of the day, my brain was fried. It was cooked. And I guess what that means was I was very easily angered. I was frustrated. I was pissed. I was short-tempered, I had little to no willpower, I was stuck on my phone. I guess that's normal, right? That's what happens when you work the brain all day. And I guess you, Stephen, if you're talking and communicating to people 8 hours a day, is your brain cooked by the end of the day? And is there a solution to what I went through? Or should I just be grateful for these tough days and know that it's not going to happen every day? And when they do happen, there's not much I can do. I just have to deal with the cooked brain.
We are human beings, right? We are human beings, and the human brain, although a miraculous organ, has its limits, right? And so, do I sometimes feel cooked at the end of the day? Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, I have to prioritize my self-care. If I don't, and if I have several days of being cooked by the end of the day without replenishing my cup, I'll burn out and I won't be effective to my patients or to my family. So just before hopping on this call, I made sure to get my workout in for the day, even though it's later in the day where I am. Um, but I hadn't gotten to it yet. And I knew that if I didn't get to it, over time, that's going to wear on me, so I made sure to go get it. So the basics of filling up our cup, exercise and cardio in particular, cardio is so good for the brain because as our heart is beating, as our blood is pumping, our brain is seeing more blood, more oxygen. We're sweating out toxins. We're increasing serotonin and endorphins. All of these things are incredible for brain health. If there's one thing that I'd recommend people do, it's get 20 minutes of good, high intensity cardio every other day, like as a minimum. Eating right, like what you put in your body matters. It really does. I didn't always know that. If you spoke with me, maybe 7 years ago, I was a person who would eat lots and lots of refined sugar and baked goods and processed foods and didn't even realize what kind of impact it was having on my brain health until I stopped all that. And part of the reason for stopping was having my first child and wanting to have good food in the house for him. And once we really cleaned up our diet, anytime I would have those types of foods again, subsequent to that, I would feel like I was in a major brain fog. And so again, it's one of those things where you don't even realize it when you're in it, but when you're not in it and you step back in, you realize just how bad you felt. So eating good food, clean food, Mediterranean style diet, paleo leaning, organic when you can, just doing our best, making the best choices we can with the budget we have. That's another way to fill up our cup. Nurturing relationships that matter to us, investing that time in those relationships, prioritizing our sleep. I mean, there's a few things about sleep that I tell every patient. Wake up the same time every day and get sun on your face. Only use the bed for sleep and try to avoid technology, especially screens, about an hour before bed. These are basics, right? These are 3 pillars to brain health: sleep, exercise, and nutrition. And if we're doing those things, at least we know we've got a fairly good amount of bandwidth to handle those brain frying days. But also, I find that if my brain is fried because of work that I have done that aligns with my purpose, I might feel tired, but I feel a sense of accomplishment at the same time. And that'll fuel me.
I guess given that majority of people that are listening, they're most likely not doing something that is 100% in alignment to them. Even sort of running my own educational consulting company, there's aspects of the business that I don't enjoy, whether it's accounting or having to development and talking to the developers, but I just have to do it. Yeah, is it possible to rewire my brain and learn to love those things and use gratitude? Or if someone's not doing something they love, do they have to make a career change?
Hmm. Well, I have worked with patients who have done both things, right? So certainly I spoke with someone earlier today who has been working in the entertainment industry and finds that he hates showing up to work every day, right? He resents it. And he has felt this way for some time. And he was on the lookout for other opportunities. And just recently, a new opportunity showed itself, and it's something that he really resonates with. And so he is making a change. But is that practical for everyone at all times? Of course not, right? Of course not. Sometimes we have to put food on the table, right? We have to pay our bills. We don't always have the luxury of being able to suddenly make a career change um, in the middle of things. So I do think that trying to find purpose within what we do matters. And sometimes that takes a reframe. You know, there are certain aspects of my job that I don't particularly enjoy. You know, I don't particularly enjoy paperwork, but I try my best to refine that as I go and to try my best to find something I can improve upon, some game that I can play with myself. You know, like for example, if I'm calling in a refill for a medication, I like to see how efficiently I can do that. I like to time myself, right? And then gamify it, right? Just see, can I achieve a goal there? And if I can, great, I feel good about it. And if I can't, I keep working towards it. The other thing is sometimes the job that we're doing because it allows us to fulfill our purpose in other areas. So if there's a particular part of the job that you don't enjoy, perhaps you tell yourself, I'm doing this because, you know, for example, I'm doing a consulting job because that's going to open up more opportunities and it's going to give me more freedom to devote time into another area of my job that I really love. Or I'm doing this so I can save up for a vacation for my family, and that's my purpose, you know. So just always remembering our why, I think, is pretty critical. And that's true for like most behavioral changes. People are always so focused on how they want to make a change, right? Like, what are the steps I'm going to do to make this change? And that's important, of course. Like, we have to figure out like how we're actually going to do it. But I think way more important than the how is the why. Like, we have to ask ourselves, why are we doing whatever it is in the first place? And if that reason doesn't bring us to tears, it's probably not motivating enough. And we're probably not going to be as bought into it. So I tell people, like an example, going back to exercise, just as kind of a simple example. If someone asks you, you know, why do you plan on exercising? And you say to be healthy, sure, that's a nice reason. It sounds good. But is that the reason that's going to drive you to tears? Probably not. So someone might then ask, why do you want to be healthy? And then you might say, to live longer. Why do you want to live longer? And then maybe we're starting to get to really what the real cause is. You know, maybe it's, I want to live a long time to see my kids grow up, you know, and maybe that's what brings you to tears. Or maybe it's, I want to develop something that my parents can be proud of, or whatever it is for the person, right? But if we connect what we're doing back to our why, it's so motivating. And it really just, you can get there with a few questions like, why does this matter to me? And why does that matter? And keep digging until you find the reason that resonates with you emotionally.
Got it. Being sort of in entrepreneurship, like I'm sort of on my 8th year, and I've noticed, for me at least, I went through like a 7-year cycle, and observing other peers at different stages of their entrepreneurship career, they seem to track the same 7-year cycle, where you quit your job because things are doing well. Usually the first 3.5 years is amazing. You're making a ton of money. You feel motivated. You're optimistic. You think you can take over the world. And then sort of around year 2, 3, 4, you start focusing on doing what you love. You start traveling. You start spending a bit of money you've made. You start focusing on your social life. You start basically trying to do what you love and search for meaning. And then sort of year 5, 6, and 7, money starts dipping, you start running out of money. And apparently there's this sort of 7-year rule where a lot of artists, actors, musicians on the 7th year, people in sports, it's a make or break year. They either go back and get a real job, or they push through and they get another 7-year cycle. But sort of at that 7th year, it's tough. And it was my toughest year last year. And then now I'm sort of on my 8th year. I'm getting into AI. I've made some pivots. I'm changing and I'm reinvigorated again. And it feels like I was on the first year again, and somehow money's starting to come in. The work I did 6 months ago is now paying dividends today, 6 months later. And I'm scared that, right now the thing that's keeping me driven is like the fact that I have employees, I have responsibilities, I need to make money, I don't want to move back home. So money is driving, I need money. And I guess that's sort of maybe what drove me in year one. But I'm scared that maybe year 3 or 4, once I build up a large set of savings again, that I'm going to repeat the same cycle. I'm going to start trying to relax because I've worked so hard for the last 3 years, and the same cycle is going to repeat itself. How do I stop the cycle from repeating?
That's such a good question. Such a good question. You know, Thinking about how do we live a life that's aligned with our purpose. Purpose can change. Purpose really can change. So on year one, your purpose is survival, making the money, just getting your business off the ground. By year 3 or 4, your purpose might start to shift a little bit into enjoying the fruits of your labor and making up lost time with people that you love. And that's not wrong. That's a very human motivation and demonstrates balance. But I think one way to avoid the extreme swings in purpose, because the truth of the matter is all those things are important to you all the time, but some of them rise to the top of your list at certain times, whereas others drop to the bottom of your list because there's only so many hours in a day. So in that vein, a simple exercise that I recommend a lot of people do is take the top 10 things that are important to you and rank them 1 to 10. And this is an honest ranking, right? This is for no one else to see. This is for you to see only. Top 10 list, 1 to 10. What are my priorities? What are the most important things to me? And then make a second list, 1 to 10, ranking those things on how much time am I spending on them, 1 to 10, and notice discrepancies and call them out. If there's something that is high on your list of importance, but low on your list of time spent, that's a discrepancy. If there's something that's not particularly important to you, but you're spending a lot of time on, that's a discrepancy. And I think it's a good idea, perhaps every 6 months or so, to do this exercise and see, am I spending my time in the areas that matter most to me? And if you are, then you're probably going to feel okay and less resentful about how you're spending your time. And there's going to be less likelihood that you need to get the payback time, right? Because you'll feel like you're living a balanced life and you'll be less likely to burn out. Because I think in entrepreneurship, in music careers, in acting, in sports, really what you're looking for is longevity and not a one-hit wonder. And I think this is how you prevent a one-hit wonder.
Because I really want to prevent it happening again. Because right now I don't even have the headspace to think about my why. I'm just trying to keep things afloat. I'm pushing and I don't even have the headspace. And if I look back at the first 7-year cycle, by year 3 and 4, there were very convincing arguments. I was not happy. I was sick of creating content on e-commerce after doing 900 videos over 3 years every single day. I wanted to start a podcast. I wanted to do vlogs. I wanted to document my life, talk about what was going in my brain. I wanted to focus on meeting new interesting people. And as I pursued what I loved and what made me happy, revenue just plummeted. And then ironically, on the 8th year, at the end of the 7th year, I've circled back and I'm getting into e-commerce again. Yes, I've made a big pivot. Now I'm sort of doing AI, but it's sort of like, it felt like it made sense. It felt like I was eating glass every day, trying to work, and I had all this money and I wasn't spending it. And there's a good chance 3 or 4 years from now, I'm going to feel the exact same way. What do I do differently this time?
How do you pace yourself differently? How would you do it differently next time? What do you think?
I think I'll try to sort of do what would happen 3, 4 years from now today. So instead of waiting 3, 4 years from now to I don't know, I've already launched a podcast, but let's say I wanted to launch a podcast about mental health. Maybe somehow start it today, despite me trying to focus on making money. And I guess like split what I would have batched and try to catch up on now, I guess, maybe.
Exactly. And that's what the top 10 list thing is, right? Because let's say in that scenario, on that list of 10 things, it's do my e-commerce videos, start a podcast, spend time with my family, travel, spend my money. These are all things that might show up on your list. And if you don't think about all those things, then suddenly it's just one thing on the list, right? I've got to do all my e-commerce videos, one a day for 3 years. Um, and you devote all your time there. And at the end of it, there's like revenge that needs to happen, right? Because at that point, you're exhausted, you're burnt out. There's only so much you can handle for that amount of time. And so it's almost like your brain wants to rebel and do the opposite. But if you divide your time up in a way that feels intentional now, so these things 4 years from now I know are going to be important to me. So they must be important to me now, and I need to spend some time on them now, then you're gonna have more longevity. And so I think that's exactly right, Andy. Do the things now,
Makes
even
sense.
if it's a little bit, right? Even if it's 15 minutes.
Makes sense, yeah. Stephen, every week, something I've added to my routine over the last few months is every Wednesday morning, I do a run club. I drive 40 minutes to the beach, do the run club in the 5 a.m. in the morning, and I spend 30 minutes to go over my goals. I just sort of do a Zoom call, I talk to myself, and before Jan, before my holiday trip, I recently went to Japan. I used to sort of have a 1 year goal, 5 year goal, and a 10-year goal. At the time I was 25, and I was like, at 30, I'd like to have met an amazing partner. I'd like to probably, maybe, hopefully have my second kid. And then I've recently shifted just because I saw this clip on Instagram. And instead of having like by 30 what I want, I sort of have like a summer goal. Spring is 0 to 25, summer is 25 to 50 years old. And my summer goal would be I'd like to build a strong foundation, have kids, raise them well, work really hard. Do you think that was a good pivot, a bad pivot? Is it good to have set dates by certain time, or is it better to keep it vague? Yeah, when you have goals, is it better to be specific or vague with them?
I think part of that depends on who you are and whether you can forgive yourself if you don't meet the specific goal. I think for some of us, we're fueled by the fear of failure. For others of us, the fear of failure paralyzes us and we give up entirely. So I think you have to take a good look at yourself and say, what works best for me without driving me crazy? And I'll tell you, some of us work better with long-term goals and some of us work better with short-term goals. And it's nice to have a mix of those because a long-term goal is great, especially, perhaps a more vague long-term goal, something that I'm working towards, whereas a more specific, defined short-term goal that helps you continue marching towards that long-term goal can feel less overwhelming, right? So maybe the long-term goal is have a top 5 podcast, related to entrepreneurship. Maybe the short-term goal is book 3 guests a week, or book a guest that has a certain number of followers on a social media platform by the end of month one, or something along those lines, right? So small digestible goals that you can work on that lead you to your larger goal. And the other thing about goal setting, there's this concept of living in the gap versus living in the gain, right? Living in the gap versus living in the gain. And so the idea is wherever we are usually short of what our goal is, right? We're still working towards our goal. But at the same time, if we're working towards a goal, presumably we're also not where we started, right? We've made some kind of gain. And so living in the gap is constantly reflecting on what we still have to do to get to our goal. And that's important, right? We need to think about it so we can continue working towards our goal. But when that's the only thing we think about, it can be very discouraging because we're only thinking about the gap. It's nice to occasionally also live in the game, right? Reflect just briefly on, wow, these are the things that I accomplished over the last 3 months. These are the things I accomplished over the last 3 years. Compared to where I started, here's where I am now. And challenge yourself to actually find things because sometimes the temptation is, well, I haven't done anything yet. I'm nowhere near my goal yet. But really, we should spend just as much time thinking about the things we still have to do as we do thinking about the things that we've already done. And maybe that's, wow, I learned from this failure or that failure, or this particular experience made me stronger, or I was able to film 900 videos in 3 years. Wow, that's not easy. I know that's not easy. That's a lot of work. So we should live in the gains also.
Interesting. What about goals that seem a bit uncontrollable? So I guess the best metaphor might be an actor that is, say, my age, 25, 26, and him wanting to be in a big picture. By the age 30, he wants to be in a film that's like a big Hollywood film. Me wanting to find a partner and have kids when I'm 30. We can't really control these things. Is it healthy to have that sort of by 30, this is what I'd like goal? Or should that actor have a more bigger picture and say, hey, from age 25 to 50, sort of my summer season, I'd like to have been in a big movie?
I think to answer your question directly, I don't think it's great to set very tight constraints on ourselves. I think the better thing to do is ask, why would that goal be important to me? Right? So for the actor, what would it mean to me to be in a big picture film by the time I'm 30? Why does that matter to me? And you might spend some time thinking about that, and it might be something along the lines of, well, I'll feel like I've really perfected my craft. I'll feel recognized for the work that I'm doing. I'll feel secure. I'll feel a sense of accomplishment. And those are the things you're really after. It's not necessarily being in the big picture film by age 30, right? It's being able to hone my craft, being able to feel a sense of accomplishment, being able to sense some sense of recognition for what I'm doing. So maybe that's the stuff that I'm after. And that's what I'm working towards every day. And if that translates to being in a big picture movie, fantastic. But the point is not necessarily the big picture movie.
That's beautiful. Yeah, because as I was asking my question, like asking those questions for myself, I'd like to have a partner because I'd like to finally meet someone that really makes me feel seen, someone that really understands me. I want to, not that I feel lonely at the moment, but I feel like it would be a beautiful cherry on top of the life I currently have. I'd like to have children because I'd love to have a little project, a little me that I can give my all to and work on and sort of help develop. But I guess these things are translatable. There's ways I can make myself feel seen. There's ways I can build a project where when I put things into it, that project is mine and it does grow. It doesn't have to be a human baby. And I guess maybe setting those goals, say maybe not even needing a due date, just like striving for those things today.
Yeah, every day, right? And am I moving towards my goals or away from my goals, right? And you can kind of ask yourself that for any sort of venture you take on, whether that's pursuit of a relationship, pursuit of a business opportunity, pursuit of a new hobby, whatever it is. Is this moving me towards those goals that I just laid out or away from my goals? And just asking the question is very informative.
Interesting. I'll probably have to sit and think about it over the next few days, but now like my whole weekly goal planning thing is just thrown out the window. Because you're right, like a lot of even thinking by my winter chapter 75 to 100, I'd love to start, I've hours, terabytes worth of footage of me documenting my journey. Like I'd love to start, like by then I'd love to dig through everything I have on my phone, my drive, and start sharing my life. And I guess if I ask myself why, I'd really want to create content that I wished I had growing up. And I guess I can do my 75-year-old goal today, and I guess that throws the whole sort of goal planning out the window. Because technically, you could do everything. If you ask why you want to do that, it would lead to a certain reason, whether it's fulfillment, creating what you wish you would have had, all those things you can do today, every day.
Absolutely. And tomorrow's not guaranteed, so seek it out today.
Yeah. I think it's just being present. Like I'm just trying to think like what I would have to change it to, like what are the things I want to do today now, and I guess it's just not thinking ahead of time, being present, because the present is all that matters and what's real.
And it's all we have. It's all that's guaranteed to us.
Yeah. Stephen, something I've recently discovered. So, like previously, I'd watch interviews from people like Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and they would always talk about focus. That's their secret power. But people would ask them, what makes you so successful? And they would all say their focus. So I would force myself to script out 500 words in a row and push through that resistance, sit down when I have that lull, and just sit down until I can get that task done. And once it's done, maybe take a break or move on. So I sort of brute force myself into focus. But recently I've been discovering that it's much more productive for me to write, say, 50 words, and when there's a lull in motivation, go and do some push-ups. Go back, write another, say, 70 words this time. Go and make my bed. Go back, write another 200 words this time. And then I'll have a lull in motivation, go to the bathroom. Or another example is, rather than sitting and getting my 50 transactions reconciled for my accounting, I would do 5, get bored, review a YouTube video. After doing 1 minute of reviewing it, get bored and switch back and forth. I was constantly switching, and every time I get bored, I switch up, get bored. Previously, I would have just forced myself to do that one thing. Have I just found what works best for me? Or am I tearing my brain apart and I should stop doing this and try to get back to having a focused brain?
Oh, no, you have found what works best for you. And I will tell you, what works for you works for me, but it doesn't work for everyone, right? So there are some people who really value that deep, hyper-focused state where they're focusing on just one thing for an extended period of time. And if something interrupts that focus, it's almost irritating or agitating. There are others of us, you and I included, who need something to break up their focus so that they can maintain the same level of vigilance on the task that they are on. And so I'm a big fan of breaking up large tasks into smaller chunks so that you're bringing your A game to each chunk, as opposed to just forcing yourself through and getting diminishing returns. Now, one thing about that is how you break up the activity matters. So going and doing push-ups, great. Going and having a nice conversation with someone you care about, great. Having a drink of water, great. Scrolling on your phone, not great, right? So again, it goes back to this idea of conserving your dopamine. So if you are doing a task that requires your focus, and then as the break, you go on your phone and you scroll for 20 minutes, coming back to the task is going to be exponentially harder, as opposed to doing some push-ups or having a healthy snack or drinking some water or walking your dog, or, healthier examples.
That's awesome. Yeah, that makes me feel real, because I felt like I unlocked something. I was like, I can't believe I just discovered this now, because I'm like, I'm literally somehow sitting down for an hour straight, jumping in between accounting and reviewing a YouTube. Obviously, it's taking twice as long because I'm doing each, but I guess it's half an hour each, so it's just the sum of the parts. It's not diminishing returns, but it really, really works. And I was just afraid that I was tearing my brain apart.
Um, I do the same thing, right? So I get lots of emails every day. I have lots of notes to write every day. I have orders to place. And I almost never just sit down and say, I'm doing all my emails now, right? I'll do a chunk of them and then I'll switch over to some other task and then I'll come back. And even, I mean, small picture that is useful to keep our brain fresh. But even when you think on a larger scale, right? So I'll give you another example. So I see a lot of patients every week. I see, yeah, it's about 8, 9 hours a day of just face-to-face interactions. And I love that. And at the same time, if that was the only thing I ever did, I might burn out sooner. So I mix up my days by posting on social media, by being invited to a podcast, by doing some advocacy work, by thinking about writing a children's book, developing a supplement. I'll try to flex these different parts of my brain so that when I come back to my main work, which is working directly with patients, I'm rejuvenated.
Interesting. Stephen, do you believe in energy and energy flow? Like when you're spending 8 hours a day talking to patients, does it feel like your energy is literally going into them? Because when you spend 8 hours a day doing emails, doing paperwork, it doesn't feel like something's being sucked out of you. But I just came back from a catch up with a friend and we had coffee and I was making sure she felt seen. I was giving her my full attention. I was present. And afterwards, I felt quite deflated. And after each podcast, after the 2 hour chat, I'm like, whoa, something has just drained out of me. What is that? Is it some energy? Is it, yeah.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if like in the example with your friend, you wanted her to be seen, you were focused on her experience, and that takes a lot of mental effort, right? I mean, it takes a lot of mental effort as opposed to just sitting on your own, not having to focus on anything but what your own needs are in that moment. So being present with another human being, inherently there is an energy transaction there. You're putting your energy into the person just as they may be putting it into you. And those transactions aren't always equal. There are going to be times where the person you're interacting with is going to require more of your energy, and there's going to be times where the opposite is true. And I think ultimately, there's no like easy way to balance that out perfectly, but the hope is that in a given person's life, those transactions equal out, right? And you have interactions that replenish you, as well as interactions where you're giving the energy. And giving the energy is not always necessarily deflating or tiring. Again, it sort of depends on the nature of that transaction. So for me, when I'm interacting with a patient and I'm giving them my attention and my focus and my care, I want to be there. I want to be doing that. And even though, yes, that can exhaust a person, it's still something that I want to be doing. And so, especially if I feel at the end of that I've made a difference or that a person is getting better or improving, I mean, that moment is something that can bring me to tears. I had that experience earlier today. Someone I've been working with a long time who is in a really good place now. And it took a lot of work to get there on both of our ends. But now they're in a really good place. And we reflected on that together, and that filled me right up.
That's beautiful. Stephen, so I guess when it comes to finding a partner, someone that you want to sort of spend the rest of your life with, given that you want to be there for your patients, this stranger, this person that might not have similar compatibilities with you, does that mean you super duper duper want to be with your partner? And it's so much more, it's to a point where you want to give your energy to it, maybe it's even to a point where this person keeps you at neutral. You don't even feel like you're having energy drained when you're having dinner or driving home from work together. Or is that too optimistic and life doesn't work that way?
I think it's pretty optimistic, because at the end of the day, relationships can be messy, right? And relationships are full of dust ups. That's a part of it, right? Like over time, you learn your partner, you learn the things that are important to them, you learn their triggers, you learn what they need to thrive as a human being. And their needs are probably going to be different than your needs. And there's going to be times where it feels like your needs are at odds with their needs, right? And so there's a lot of negotiation and understanding, and ultimately the thing that fuels you there is the love, because you ultimately want your partner to be happy, and you want yourself to be happy, and you want the relationship to be healthy. And so there's a series of sacrifices that happen there. We all have different attachment styles. There's some of us who have an anxious attachment where we feel the need to check in on our partner and make sure that the relationship is in a healthy place, and we feel the need to have direct conversations if something feels like it's not going right. And there's some of us with avoidant attachments, right? Like we value the alone time. We want to be by ourselves. We might retreat in the face of confrontation, and we might withdraw. And the interesting thing is, those are the people who find each other, right? The anxious attachment and the avoidant attachment. And sometimes that can set up pain cycles, right? Because the anxious attached person reaches out to the avoidant person and says, there's this problem, we need to address it. The avoidant person retreats because they feel uncomfortable with the whole situation. The anxious person is now more anxious. And so you can see how the cycle perpetuates itself. And part of being with a partner that you care about is identifying those pain cycles and saying, hey, wait a minute, I see what's happening here, right? And I care about you, and I don't want to feed into your pain cycle. And we obviously want the same thing, which is a healthy relationship. So let's both think about how to change this cycle. And that's an example of the compromise that has to come with any loving relationship. I mean, I suppose every now and then two people meet each other where they are just 100% compatible and there's no pain cycles that are ever created, but I think that's probably a rare exception.
Interesting. And Stephen, given you have all this knowledge, you have all these different exercises and tools, does that mean you probably rarely ever feel depressed, sad, stressed? Because I guess you have all these tools. It's sort of like, yeah, do you still feel those? Do you go through those periods?
Oh no, I have no emotions whatsoever, Andy.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah, no. Of course not, right? Like again, I'm a human being. I get mad, I get sad, I get frustrated, I get anxious. I give parenting advice, and then there are times where I'll find myself getting really frustrated with my kids. Like most people, I'm doing my best, right? I'm doing my best, and I'm gonna have some good days, and I'm gonna have some days where things are more challenging. I often know the right thing to do, but something about human behavior is we all often default to neural networks that were laid down as children, right? So, however it was that we were raised, whatever we witnessed growing up, whatever our go-to ways of coping were, we often revert back to those automatically, unless we're being very, very intentional about handling it a different way. And so that means almost all of us, myself included, we're going to have times where we revert back to that. And the key is just catching it as soon as you can, right? And then if you have done something that wasn't helpful or productive, like let's say yell at your kid, you try to repair it, you try to repair it and acknowledge it and talk about it with your child so that you're helping them lay down healthier go-to ways of coping. So that when they're an adult, maybe it'll come a little bit easier.
Something that I've heard come up again and again is people talking about working on their childhood trauma. And then I guess people always talk about that's what they're working on, that's what they're working on with their therapist. I guess I find it maybe hard to relate. Maybe I've gotten lucky where I somehow got a DNA spin where I openly talk about things in my childhood with people. I'm often, I share that, I used to crave my dad's attention when I was young. I share that I felt ostracized and unseen in high school, and I struggled to sort of make friends. I share about the different insecurities that I feel, and I don't know if that's me doing therapy, and as a result, it doesn't bottle up, and I don't have trauma. But I guess, yeah, what am I doing? Is that why I don't have trauma? Is it because I'm talking about it, or do I just not have trauma? Yeah.
Well, I think the fact that you're talking about it is huge, right? Because trauma and stress have to find a way out of the body. I have to, right? I just think of that as a rule of physics, right? Like stress and trauma have to find a way out of the body. And so the question is, how do they get released? Many people suppress. And then the trauma is going to come out perhaps emotionally, right? As depression, anxiety, stress. Sometimes it comes out physically. I've seen patients who will have neurological symptoms related to trauma that they have suppressed and have not experienced emotionally. And this can be pretty dramatic. I mean, there's a diagnosis called, it used to be called conversion disorder, where someone is experiencing some sort of psychological distress, trauma, and it's bottled up, suppressed, and it manifests as something like not being able to walk or having seizures or not being able to see. And it's not that the body structurally is broken, right? If you do structural imaging and tests, things appear as though they should be working fine, but functionally they aren't. And that's another example of stress finding a way out of the body. In that case, physical. For you, you're talking about everything openly, right? You're having these open conversations, you're processing it live. And I think that's probably been a way that you've been able to prevent yourself from experiencing emotional or physical manifestations of trauma. Because what is therapy really? Therapy is an opportunity to process past pains, but also to develop insight into why we feel the way we feel. And if you're sort of doing that day in and day out through healthy communication, that's been very protective for you.
There's a friend that I'm sort of confused about where they're so optimistic. They're very happy, they're very appreciative, they're very grateful, but at the same time, there's things that would brush aside. Like if I asked about their father, they'd be like, oh, I don't want to talk about that, and we'd move on to the next topic. So it feels like that there is something bottling up. But I guess maybe all that gratitude or all that gratefulness or that optimism, that face that they sort of put out to the world, maybe it's a band-aid holding it back. I'm not too sure, but I do feel like there's something bottled where I feel like when I'm spending time with this person, I'm not really connecting with them. It feels like we're sort of having this transactional back and forth conversation, and it doesn't feel like I'm connecting with them. Yeah, I guess I'm just confused with what's happening. Maybe you would have better thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know this person, but there's this concept called conscious negativity bias. And the idea is, does our brain tend to focus on the negative or the positive, right? It's basically glass half empty versus glass half full type thinking. And when someone has a high degree of conscious negativity bias, their brain hangs on to all the problems and the discrepancies and the errors. This is the person that might have 10 interactions, 9 of them are amazing and feel great, one of them not so much, and they think about the one over and over and over. And then the opposite end of that is the person who really sees the positive in everything, either naturally or as something that they're trying to force, as a way to really try very hard to see things through rose tinted lenses. And I actually worry about people on both ends of that spectrum, both extremes, because I think, in my opinion, the healthiest thing for the brain is to be somewhere in between, right? To be able to acknowledge the problems and not run away from them, not ignore them, but also to be able to acknowledge the wins and the successes. And not knowing much about your friend other than what you've told me, a concern that would jump out to me would be, is this person trying to bury the things that are actually bothering them and overcompensate by wearing rose-tinted lenses? And that could be working for them in the short term, but the analogy is, I don't know if you've heard the story of someone who's gifted a baby tiger. They're gifted a baby tiger. They don't want this tiger. They didn't ask for a tiger, but they don't want to kill the tiger, right? So they keep it in a cage in the back of their house. And they're not cruel, so they'll feed the tiger, occasionally because they don't want it to just die. But they definitely don't spend any time with it, and it's just hanging out. But over time, the tiger grows, as tigers will, right? Gets bigger and stronger. And eventually, at some point, it's going to be strong enough to break out of that cage. And you're going to have to face that tiger. So the question is, do you face the baby tiger now or the big ferocious tiger later? And that's the image that popped into my head when you were talking about that acquaintance of yours, that friend of yours. Is there a baby tiger that they're trying to suppress through positive outlook, but also not acknowledging the things that might actually be going on? And although gratitude is fantastic, positivity is fantastic, I mean, absolutely, we should all be doing that. I also think that we don't want to use that as an avoidance of something that might really be mattering and bothering us.
Yeah, I think that there was like an example that made me struggle or made me confused. Usually I sort of, I'm not saying I'm like okay at reading people and understanding where people are at, but there was like a example where the friend was calling me and they were like, hey, I was like, oh, how's things been on your end? And the friend was like, yeah, everything's awesome, things are great. Recently I found out there was this competitor, they ripped my business, copied my videos, and at first I was mad because that person was getting more views than me. They just literally took my formula and I felt very insecure. But then, I actually used it to motivate me. It actually made me up my game, and it sort of, the person reached out and now we're friends. And the reason I felt confused was like, the friend acknowledged the problem, talked about it openly, and seemed to be secure about the problem, but for some reason it didn't really feel like the friend processed that issue. And I was confused because usually when I talk about the flaws and the things I'm struggling with, it doesn't feel like that.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, that could represent premature closure, right? Like someone really trying to rationalize through something quickly so that they close the door on it fast and it doesn't bother them quite as long. But at the same time, I mean, again, it's not a person I've met, but perhaps they did. Perhaps they did process everything and work through it, and they're reflecting their true experience. That's possible. That's certainly possible. It's also possible that they're trying really, really hard to see the good in what that experience was, which, if it's working for them and they genuinely feel at peace with what happened and they're not lying to themselves, then more power to them. I mean, that's a healthy way of coping, as long as we're really like true to ourselves and acknowledging, like, is this actually working for me, or is this something that I really want to be working for me, but maybe it isn't.
I don't know if this is the best metaphor for that incident, but I don't know, through watching movies, I can imagine the war veteran talking to the therapist, and the war veteran has all these nightmares, bed sweats. But during the therapy session, he's like, yeah, like war was bad. I saw people die. It made me feel stressed. I was scared for my life. So he was openly talking about all the things he saw, but he was maybe saying in a very monotone, robotic way. It was like he was just printing out and saying all the things he saw, how it made him feel. I was very scared, but he wasn't emotionally saying what he experienced. I guess, is that something I'm just
That's dissociation. What
Oh,
that is dissociation. So in that example of the war vet, they're talking about their life as if they're reading it from a book.
yes.
And usually a person dissociates if the topic is so emotionally charged that they just can't emotionally go there in the moment because there's a fear of loss of control. And so they take on it's almost out of body, like you're talking about your life as if you're reading it, as opposed to like, this is the stuff I went through, right? This is what I remember. This is the sound of the body falling next to me. Like their brain feels like it can't go there because of the fear and the loss of control that comes with it. So they dissociate. Kids do this too, right? Kids do this too. If a child has been through a significant trauma, they oftentimes can't be fully present for that. They need to dissociate as a way to protect themselves from what's actually happening. And when they recall the trauma later on, they might re-enter that dissociative state. And you can see it in talking to people who have been through trauma. Sometimes they'll begin to talk about their trauma and you'll see them still be present in body, but not in mind, as if they're drifting away. Their eyes might not seem as present. They're not as locked into the conversation. Maybe they're fidgeting or doing some kind of repetitive movement, and you maybe their voice volume is changing, the tone is changing, maybe they sound more distant. That's dissociation, and that's them trying to protect themselves from the feelings that are coming up. And when you see that in a person and you recognize it, the best thing you can do for that person is gently steer the conversation elsewhere, bring them back to the present, help them feel grounded, help them feel seen. You've used that term, um, and and then you'll know when they're back.
That's awesome. On the other spectrum, Stephen, recently I've met some really talented, amazing friends, people, and nice, awesome people, super duper smart. And they sort of told me, they're on SRIs. Now, this is new to me. I haven't met a person on SRIs, and I know that, they've, I guess, tried many different things, talked to many different therapists, and this seems to be the only thing that keeps them stable. And given that this is the first time meeting one or two friends that I don't know how to interpret. Is this someone I should avoid? Is this normal? Is this just like a person that has genetic diabetes and they just take a shot and there's nothing? Or is this a person that maybe is a narcissist and I should avoid? I don't know how to interpret it because this is the first time meeting very amazing people on SRIs.
Yeah, no, I understand where the question is coming from, because as a society, I think mental health conditions are viewed very differently than other biological conditions. But at the end of the day, mental health conditions are brain health conditions. And if you take that person on the SSRI and you take a look at what their brain looks like off the SSRI, you're going to see lots of increased activity in various emotional structures within the brain. And what does an SSRI do? It enhances serotonin level within the brain. There's other things that enhance serotonin, exercise, nutrition, therapy. But for some people with structures that are so hot, sometimes it's not enough. And an SSRI might be a useful part of the treatment plan. So I would view it very much in line with someone who has hypertension and they've tried to modify their diet, they've tried to exercise, and yet they just can't get their blood pressure down. And so they take an antihypertensive. I think definitely not something to be afraid of, definitely not something to avoid. If anything, the people who are seeking out treatment and trying to get better are probably people to gravitate towards.
Mm, yeah, because yeah, I guess that adds a lot of context because just because I try to keep away from people that are maybe takers, people who are maybe subconsciously negative, people who have egos, people who are insecure, just because I know with time it's gonna seep into me. So I was like if someone's on SRIs, is that someone I should spend less time with? But I guess based on what you're saying, the answer is probably no.
Yeah, no, I'd say no. Most common reason to be on an SSRI is anxiety or depression. Those would be the two most common reasons to be on one. So there's not really any medication cure for a personality disorder, for example. So narcissism, being one example that you mentioned. So if someone's on an SSRI, it's probably not because someone thought, hey, this is going to cure their narcissism. Here we go. It's probably more that someone's dealing with underlying depression or anxiety, and this is something that is helping them for the time being. I will say SSRIs are oftentimes overprescribed because of the model of psychiatry we talked about earlier, where appointments are so fast and the physician feels like they need to do something, and the dogma is prescribe a medication. And there's plenty of people that I see that do really, really well with other strategies outside of medication. But there's a place for medication. I prescribe medications every day, and it can be a useful tool for some people if it's thought about carefully.
I love that. Stephen, what's your thoughts with, say, religion and mental health? Is there any correlation? Are people that are religious less prone to depression? For example, yesterday after I had that really long day, it was like two 11-hour days in a row. One thing I wrote down as I was sort of decompressing into my notes, I was like, I need to see these tough days as a gift from God. I don't often get these tough long days. They might happen once a week, once every second week. And I know there's a reason for them. And, I've had days where they were easy, which means they were boring. And these days are so chaotic. So I saw it as a gift from God. So obviously, I have maybe a different definition of God than what people might think God is. But that one small shift, all of a sudden, I was like, wow, I'm so thankful for that tough day yesterday.
Absolutely. I think religion is one example of spirituality. And when we are able to connect with something bigger than us, it has a tremendously powerful impact on our mental health. And so, why do some people who have religious practices report higher levels of peace? Part of it is connection to something bigger than themselves. Part of it is connection to a community of like-minded individuals. Part of it is faith. Part of it is putting your trust in something outside of you. And I think all these things, when leveraged properly, are really great ways of staying grounded. And that, again, it doesn't have to mean religion per se, although it can certainly be, but it's just connecting with something bigger than you. We all need to do that. Otherwise, our problems feel like the only problems.
Stephen, you might be out of my own ignorance, but you see kids that are iPad kids. They're just on the iPad all the time, on the phone scrolling, and it obviously looks like a problem. And I don't know if out of my naivety, I think that when I have kids in the future, I'll just not give them an iPad. I'll just not buy them a phone, and problem solved. But if the solution was that easy, there'd be a lot more kids not stuck on their phones. Yet I see very educated parents with their kids with an iPad. Obviously, they limit the times. Is my solution too naive? Like, what would then cause me to make the same mistake and somehow my kid all of a sudden has a phone and an iPad?
Yeah. Well, Maybe you've seen memes on social media of the parent like, oh, I'm never gonna let my kid be on an iPad, and
Yeah.
then it flash forwards and then now it's like, here's the iPad, quiet.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I think it's a noble goal, and I think there's a few things working against that goal. One is technology is everywhere, even in schools, right? Like there are, like most schools, curriculum will be on some kind of electronic device, and kids will be expected to access homework on their phone or homework on an iPad. And I mean, it's actually a rare exception, at least in the US, to find a school that is a no technology school. I know of all the patients I see, I know of maybe two or three that are enrolled in such a school. That's one piece. The other piece is all of their friends are going to be on electronic devices. And there's a social piece to this. Nowadays, kids are not just riding their bike to the neighbor's house to hang out unannounced, like maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Now people are connecting on Snapchat or playing a game online together. And to just eliminate that social connection can also be damaging for a child. So I think eliminating technology is a really tough ask. And so what I tell parents is how you regulate the technology is really what matters most. So, for example, there's some exceptions. Like if a kid is under 18 months, they really shouldn't be seeing any kind of screen time, right? Like, I mean, that is relatively easy to manage because an 18-month-old doesn't have much say. um, but then beyond that, you want to limit screen time ideally to things that aren't short form content, right? So not things where they're scrolling really quickly through all sorts of stuff, but more longer form content, something that has a plot, a beginning, a middle, and end. Ideally, something that has good educational content, and ideally, something that is co-watched, right? So where a parent is at least within earshot of what is being consumed, and then occasionally helping the child connect that to reality. Like, oh, did you hear that character said that? That reminds me of when you did this, or, like bringing it back to real life. And then as the kid gets older, putting limits on the amount of screen time. No child should be just on behind a screen, the entire day. You want to set some reasonable limits. And for a school age child, that might look like we're not going on screens until we've done all of our homework. When we do go on a screen, it's for X amount of time. Maybe it's an hour. Ideally, it's educational content, not short form. Ideally, there's some kind of connection that's happening either with friends or with the parent. And then that screen time is not going to bleed in to 1 hour before bed, right? So those are reasonable parameters so that they're still able to access that technology like all of their friends, but it's also not poisoning their brain.
Something that was on the complete other spectrum, this hypothesis I heard from this, I guess, businessman named Naval Ravikant. He talked about giving his kids unlimited freedom. His sort of criteria was like, my kids, all they have to do each day is, I don't know if the exact numbers, but it's, 30 minutes of reading, 30 minutes of learning how to code, maybe 30 minutes of mathematics. I'm mixing that up. But other than that, if they get that done, they get unlimited freedom. They can play as much games as they want. They can do whatever want. He treats them as adults. So that, like, let's say they get hungry, they're gonna go find food. If they're playing the game too much and they poop in their pants, they're gonna find out that's not pleasurable, so they don't do that and they go to the toilet when needed. If they play too many games, they might get a headache, so they learn to play less. If they don't get enough sleep or they don't finish an assignment, the teacher will scream at them so they won't repeat that mistake. And I was like, whoa, like this is a complete 180. I was like, yeah, I thought it might work, but obviously I'm looking at your reaction and you're nodding. So what's your thoughts, Stephen?
Sounds like a terrible idea to me. I think it's a mistake to expect adult decision making from a brain that is not fully developed. The prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until we are in our mid 20s. The prefrontal cortex is the decision maker in our brain. It is what weighs pros and cons. It's what thinks about long-term consequences. It's what helps us control our impulses. And the notion that a child is to figure all those things out on their own and make their own decisions along the way, I think is lazy parenting. As a parent, our job is to be on the leading edge of our child's development. And that means helping them understand how to make the right decisions. And sure, if you leave a child to their own devices, they might figure out that they poop their pants if they play video games for too long. But what's the cost there, right? What's the cost there? All the while they're wiring their brain. These are kids that are probably going to have ADHD if they didn't already, right? Um, these are kids that are probably going to have self-esteem issues if they didn't already. These are kids who probably are going to feel less connected and less supported by their parent. And so are likely to develop an avoidant attachment style as an adult. I just, I couldn't disagree more with that approach.
Interesting. I guess, Stephen, for me, the thought of having to watch everything my kid does, be present with him 5, 6 hours a day, put limits on everything he does and punish him when he goes past the limits and rush him to bed, it feels unsustainable, feels impossible, especially if you have your own business and you're trying to keep your wife happy and maintain a social life. And obviously, giving the kid no attention is on the opposite spectrum. And then in between is maybe even worse because you're not doing either. What's the best way, or what's your thoughts on the best way to raise kids?
First of all, raising kids is hard work. And the best parents in the world are the ones who feel like they aren't doing it right. The best parents in the world are the most exhausted parents in the world and often the most insecure parents in the world. Parenting is hard. I have a 3-year-old boy. I have a 6-year-old boy. Raising them is the most incredible thing and important thing I have ever done. And it is also the hardest thing that I have ever done. And I've done hard things. So I say that to say it is going to require a lot of work. It is going to require a lot of attention. And that's going to change depending on the age that the child is, like at the stage that my kids are now, they require lots of support and lots of guidance. The 3-year-old, he's learning how to manage emotions. The 6-year-old has less need because he's more developed as a human being. And then there's going to come an age where they're going to require very little of our attention, and they're actually going to push us away. And we're going to miss the days where we were so involved and so needed. And so when I'm in the heat of it, I try to think about that, right? Like because there are hard days. I mean, my night tonight before hopping onto the call involved getting the 2 kids with my wife showered and teeth brushed and, diaper on the 3-year-old and, all these things. And there's resistance every step of the way. And by the end of it, you're just like, my gosh, what just happened? But in those moments, I try to visualize them when I remember to do this as like an 18-year-old kid who is doing his own thing and is hanging out with his friends and doesn't really want me to be there. And then in that moment, I'm probably going to think back to these moments now and I'm probably going to cry. So I try to remember that. But there's no hack for parenting. It's just hard work. But you do it because you love your kid and you want the best for your kid.
That's beautiful. Thinking about sort of nature versus nurture, me and my 2 sisters, we're all very different. and my mum raised us all in the same ways. There's definite commonalities, but we're all going through different parts in life. And I guess a lot of entrepreneurs and founders, they'd like all their kids to take on the family business, and most of the time the kid wants nothing to do with the family business. So they all sort of look at, say, the Bernard Arnault's family, the founder of LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Hennessy. Somehow Bernard Arnault has gotten all his kids into the family business. They all run Tiffany and Co, Rimowa, and I don't know if that's really impressive or is that's unnatural, and the kids have been sort of put through a system where as a result they're all part of the family business. I guess maybe it is selfish of me to want to have kids that are little clones of me, or maybe the other side of me is have a ton of kids and play the numbers game. One out of the 7 kid is gonna be wired just like me and would wanna do exactly what I want to do, and the other 6 give them freedom.
Yeah. Well, first off, I don't think it's a selfish desire. I think part of like a natural human pull is to raise a child that is a piece of you, and I'll tell you, my 2 sons are so dissimilar. My 3-year-old has the personality of my wife. My 6-year-old has my personality, and they're both very, very different. They're both very unique individuals. They've both been raised the same way. They eat the same food. They've had the same home, same parents, same everything. But fundamentally, they're wired so differently. And I think as a parent, of course, there's a desire to see your child transform into what you imagined they might transform into. But I think we have to keep that desire in check, because if we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, that's going to set up a child to feel inadequate and unfulfilled and depressed. And what I care about for my kids, would I love one of them to become a psychiatrist? Sure, that could be very cool. But is that the ultimate thing I care about? No. What I really care about, and I think most parents, as they really get to know their child, and the child is not just a concept, right? But more like an actual human being standing in front of them. I think the natural desire becomes, I really want this little thing to be happy. I really want this human being in front of me to pursue something that fulfills them. And one thing that I tell my kids, not so much yet because they're young, but that I will tell them more when they're older, is pursue what you love and strive to be really good at it. Pursue what you love and strive to be really good at it. And if that so happens to be what I do, great. Sure. I mean, I'll show you the ropes. And if not, I'll be here to support you.
Stephen, I'd love to get your perspective on my current hypothesis. I've held this hypothesis for raising kids quite a long time. Usually a lot of my perspectives and hypotheses have changed, but this has remained constant. And I'd love to get your perspective. Thinking about what made me who I am, my approach, that I don't know, might be wrong, and I'm open to feedback. My thought is, when I have kids, obviously give them the bare necessities, shelter, food, clothes, but give them nothing. Meaning, if they go to school and they come home and they're like, Dad, my friend Johnny has an iPhone. Can you buy me an iPhone? I'd probably say to my kid, yeah, most definitely. Let's figure out, how much is an iPhone, and let's figure out how you can make this. And then, if he wants to do a lemonade stand, I'll help him do that. And if he finds out that, this is too much work, I'm actually going to just go through life without an iPhone and borrow Johnny's iPhone because I don't want it that badly to get a job to do it. So, I guess my hypothesis is give my kid nothing but the bare necessities and help them get, if there is something they want, I'll help them figure it out.
I like what you're onto there. And helping them get what they want can also look like having them earn something that they would like. And that could be through a lemonade stand. That could be through completing a series of responsibilities at home. That could be, it's going to be different for every parent and what their value structure is, but that could be a reward for having done a certain thing or performed at a certain level. Or I think ultimately human behavior is best shaped through reward as opposed to punishment. So if someone feels like they're working towards something and things are not just guaranteed to them, that does set up persistence and drive in an individual. And it also avoids the risk of spoiling your child, right? A child who is entitled to receive whatever they want whenever they want it. So I like what you're onto. Yes, I mean, your job as a parent is to provide them with the necessities, food, clothing, shelter. And then for things that are more of a luxury or commodity, yeah, let's do it. Earn it. Let's earn it. And you can earn it on your own. You can raise up money doing, something that I help you supervise with, and I'll be really excited with you and we'll do it together. Or you can earn it here at home too, right? It doesn't have to be money. You can set up a token economy, right? Like you do everything you've been asked for the entire week, you get 5 points. 5 points equates to this, and you can budget it, and you can keep a bank account of those points, and you could get very creative. Maybe you keep the points in the bank account and you accrue interest. I mean, you can teach a lot of fundamental life skills at home. And I don't think things should be guaranteed. I don't think kids should be just given anything they want at a moment's notice. Things should be earned. So I agree with you on that.
Beautiful. Stephen, has there been studies on, the TV has been around for quite some time. Right now the phone is quite recent, so we don't know the consequences of what 3 generations down would look like given the phones. Has there been studies for what people look like after the TV, and can we correlate that? How dangerous is the phone?
It is impossible on a SPECT scan, the type of scan we do, to differentiate addiction to methamphetamine versus addiction to the cell phone.
Whoa.
The same parts of the brain light up. So, do phones have an impact on brain health? Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly. I have seen kids with severe technology addictions, and those kids behave in the same way that a meth addict does, or a cocaine addict does, or a heroin addict does. They crave use of the phone. They start using it, but end up using it for longer than they intended. If they're not using it, they have withdrawal symptoms. If they're not using it, they're thinking about using it. They need to use it. If that sounds like addiction, it's because it is, right? It's the same parts of the brain that light up. So we have to kind of treat these devices with respect. And that's why the person you mentioned earlier about giving free rein to their child, you wouldn't give your child free rein to methamphetamine. So that's why I disagreed strongly.
One thing that I've been seeing on my feed is porn is bad, like very bad. Could you educate me on how bad it is? Like, I've been through periods where I just quit for a month. I've been through periods maybe I would watch it once a day. I've been through periods where maybe it's only 2 or 3 times a week. And I don't feel any differences. It doesn't feel like this really bad thing as I've tested different things. Has it been over exaggerated? Any thoughts?
You might not have an addictive personality. I mean, it doesn't sound like you necessarily do, but I think there's a few dangers with porn. One, as with anything that enhances dopamine level transiently, porn does run the risk of developing addictive tendencies in people who are susceptible. That doesn't mean everyone who watches porn is going to become addicted to porn, just like not everybody who drinks alcohol becomes an alcoholic. But the risk is certainly there. I think the other thing that porn can do is create a very unrealistic expectation of sex because obviously the way things are portrayed in porn, it's very regimented in some ways, not necessarily reflective of what a true sexual encounter between two human beings would look like. And that can create a false narrative in someone's mind and create expectations that might be impossible to fulfill. And so that's another concern that can come up with porn. But I think as with anything, risk is individualized. There's some people who will watch porn and not necessarily have it impact them all that much, and there's others who will fall into a hole that they have a hard time getting out of.
Talking about dopamine regulation, there'll be times where I would have a long day of work, I'll feel quite down, and I have this urge to call a friend, urge to talk to someone, and there'll be a spike in dopamine, I'll feel happy, I'm talking to someone, and after the call ends, I'm back home alone, it dips drastically, probably dips even lower than where I was. And recently I've been forcing myself not to call people when I'm feeling down and just sit in it, feel it, process it, and just not reaching out in general, unfortunately. And surprisingly, I felt much, much more happy. Am I regulating dopamine? Is it because I get dopamine when I'm chatting with friends and it's the same like jumping on TikTok when feeling down? Yeah.
So as you're talking with the friend, are you talking about the thing that's bothering you?
It'll probably end up sort of like a normal conversation where it would sort of be a bit of back and forth with updating each other on what's going on. It wouldn't be solely focused on me, even though that's what I might be craving, because I wouldn't want to put that on the other person to just hear me yap for the next hour, because I know what that feels like being on the receiving end. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you hang up the call, how is it that you feel?
It feels like I sort of had a temporary band-aid on that downness and loneliness that I was feeling. And the moment I hang up, it's sort of that person is now gone and no longer thinking about me, and I feel even more alone, and it feels like that was just a temporary fix, a temporary hit of dopamine.
Yeah. Or perhaps an avoidance.
Hmm.
Um, I think, again, it depends on what the intent of the conversation is and you sort of telling yourself that going into it, right? Like, hey, I'm feeling kind of down right now and I've had a long day and I could really use connection with another human being. And that's the purpose of this call is to connect with another human being. Then I think just stating that intent to yourself before making the call could be really helpful, as opposed to, oh gosh, man, it's been such a bad day. Let me just call this person. And then you forget about the bad day while you're on the phone, and then you hang up. And now the delta, the drop of talking to someone that you enjoy talking to falling back to where you were feels like an even larger drop than where you were to begin with. So I think setting the intention. And then also, I think you are a very, just in getting to know you over the last couple hours, I think you're a very insightful person. And you are an intentional person. And I think you are intentional about trying to have other people be seen. And then you have some concern maybe about making people feel like they need to see you. And I think knowing that can help you modulate that too, right? So it's okay for you to take up space as well, in the same way that you want other people to be seen. So if you're having one of these calls, by all means, like talk about some of your problems, right? And that doesn't mean you have to dominate the conversation, but you also deserve to take up space.
I love that. Stephen, what's your thoughts on introverts versus extroverts? That whole sort of paradigm on how introverts gain energy when they're on their own and lose energy when they're with people, and extroverts, I guess, gaining energy when they're around people. Is it this 50-50 thing? Because like recently I was having this chat with a friend, and introverts are people who can fill their own cup in their own time, and extroverts are unable to fill their own cup. They require outside stimuli, and they normalize it with the term extroversion. It's normal. But based on what we shared was like, maybe extroversion is actually a bad thing, not a normal thing.
I have a patient who is an introvert who fantasizes about becoming an extrovert. He he wants so badly to be an extrovert, and he isn't one, right? Because that's just not how he's wired. And we started getting into, why is it that you want to be an extrovert? Like what is it about extroversion that appeals to you so much? And what he said was, well, it just seems like they're so confident, right? It seems like they've got it all together. They can talk with people easily. And I challenged him on that thought. I said, do you really think? Do you really think that they're so confident, right? Do you really think that they have it all together? What's the evidence that you have for that? Is there any evidence that you have to the contrary? And the reality is, introverts versus extroverts, no one is there's not a right or wrong way to be. It's not that extroverts are happier than introverts. It's just how they're coping. We're all finding a way to cope, right? And extroverts cope by connection with others, and introverts cope by processing. It's sort of kind of akin to the attachment styles that we were talking about earlier, avoidant versus anxious attachment. It's not like one attachment style is right or wrong. It's just we're wired differently. And part of it is accepting how we're wired and not fantasizing about needing to be wired the other way, right? You hear about introverts masking as extroverts, extroverts who, want to be an intro, like all this, just know who you are, accept who you are, and be able to modulate that when you need to, right? I mean, there's going to be times as an introvert where perhaps it would be wise of you to take on some extrovert mannerisms, right? To make a connection or to forge a relationship. But I don't think any one of us should be trying to be something we're not. I think authenticity is more important than either introversion or extroversion.
I love that, Steve. I have these two questions I'm going to try tie together, but I wanted to ask, like, for the average listener, this was the question one, using the 80-20 rule, what are things they can do to be more happy, less depressed, wake up with more motivation? Not everyone can see a therapist or get psychiatry. What can our average listeners do? And then the second question I had was talking about diet. Like, diet feels so overwhelming. Like, recently I learned apparently they've done studies, and grass-fed cows have the highest content of microplastics. And obviously microplastics leads to things like infertility, cancer. So all of a sudden, like, I can't eat beef. Like, diet itself feels so overwhelming. Like, I try to eat, eggs, beef, cow, try to eat non-processed foods, but now I'm learning that, they're injecting chickens with steroids, and I'm like eating this chicken being unsure. So those are the two questions.
Absolutely. So 80-20 rule. Three pillars to brain health, like we talked about earlier: sleep, exercise, nutrition. It is hard to build a healthy brain without those three things being present. So ways to try to optimize your happiness: 20 minutes of good, higher intensity cardio 4 days a week. That has been shown in studies to increase serotonin to the same extent, if not more, as an SSRI, right? So it's nature's SSRI. Sleep. The brain is active during sleep, right? Sleep is not a passive process. The brain is literally cleaning itself during sleep, getting rid of toxic aggregates that accumulate over time. Sleep is extremely important to brain health. So prioritizing your sleep and avoiding things like revenge insomnia, which is scrolling on the phone until late into the night because you feel like, well, I worked really hard today, I deserve this. And then nutrition. So any food in excess can be a toxin. And this is why I really preach balanced diet, because nowadays, anything you read up on, if you dig deep enough, you'll find that there are problems with it. Kale, oxalates, fish, heavy metals, rice, arsenic. You just mentioned microplastics in beef. I mean, you could very, very quickly overwhelm yourself. And this is where moderation and balance comes in. As long as we're not overly reliant on any one single thing and we spread out our nutrition intuitively, we're probably going to be okay, right? So the type of diet I recommend to people, Mediterranean style diet that leans paleo. So plenty of lean proteins. So for someone who's not a vegetarian, grass-fed beef, bison, eggs, chicken, turkey, lamb, plant-based proteins. These are all good examples. Healthy fats. Okay, the brain is 60% fat after you take the water out. Avocado, nuts, seeds, olive oil, avocado oil, fruits and vegetables, the rainbow, ideally, right? Some fruits are better than others. Some fruits are very high in sugar, like mangoes, grapes, pineapple. Less of that, not avoid it altogether, but less of that, more of the berries and the melons. And then complex carbs, sweet potatoes, quinoa, millet, for example. So that's a diet that for most people is going to sustain the brain really, really well and is going to be balanced enough that you don't have to worry about all of the little nuances and idiosyncrasies that are just frankly impossible to avoid without driving yourself crazy.
I love that. That just spawned one more little question I wanted to quickly ask. Sleep. My current process, and I'll share what I would like, but maybe you'll tell me what my current one works perfectly fine. But currently my process is I try to phones away at 8 p.m., get ready for bed, read at 9, and I read until exhaustion. Some days I'm really tired and I'll only read 5 pages and I'll fall asleep. Some days I'd read 40 pages and all of a sudden it's 11:30 p.m. and that's when I'm tired and I'll fall asleep. And then when I wake up, I don't have an alarm. If I sometimes need less sleep, such as today, I might wake up at 7:30. If sometimes I might need more sleep, I'll wake up at 9. So I'm sort of naturally reading till exhaustion, waking up when needed. But obviously, ideally, I'd love to clock off the same time every day, wake up the same time every day. But I seem to not be able to do that. Some days I'm less tired than others. Some days I need more sleep than others. Is my current process okay, or should I try push for the recommended?
I might adjust your process in a couple ways. First question, are you reading in bed?
Yes.
So that would be something to change.
Okay.
Here's the three kind of guiding principles around sleep. And this comes from a whole line of therapy called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. The three guiding principles are try to wake up the same time every day as an adult. The reason for that is when you wake up sets your circadian rhythm for the next 24 hours. It's more important than when you go to bed. So the ideal is wake up around the same time every day and get sun on your face. That sets your circadian rhythm. The sun helps drop melatonin level and will set you up for a better night's sleep the next night. The second cardinal rule you're already doing, avoid screens an hour before bed, because our brain has not evolved to be able to differentiate light from a screen versus light from the sun. And the third is only use the bed for sleep or sex, nothing else. Okay. And the reason for that is something called sleep efficiency. So it's a ratio. Sleep efficiency is the number of hours you're asleep in bed divided by the number of hours you're in bed. And so, for example, if you're reading in bed for a couple hours before you sleep, and then you sleep for 7 hours or 8 hours, let's say 8 for math. 8 divided by 10 would be 80%. Not a terrible sleep efficiency, but ideally you want it to be 90% or more. So any hour you spend in bed not sleeping is chipping away at your sleep efficiency. The reason you want a sleep efficiency of 90% or more is because that predicts deeper sleep. So sleep is not just total number of hours, it's also how much of that is actually deep restorative sleep. And there's plenty of people who sleep 8 hours and only get 20 minutes of deep sleep. So only using the bed for sleep and instead reading in like a chair next to the bed is one way to help preserve sleep efficiency. So if I were you, what I would try doing is wake up the same time every day, get sun on your face, and see what it's like to read in a comfortable chair next to the bed as opposed to in the bed itself.
Two quick follow-up questions. One, is there a difference between 2 hours of reading here, 8 hours of sleep in my bed, versus 2 hours of reading in my bed plus 8 hours of sleep? So that's
Yes.
first. Okay. Oh,
That is different because ultimately what you're trying to do is create an association for your brain that bed is sleep. You don't want your brain guessing, right? Oh, we're in bed now. Does that mean we're going to be reading? Does that mean we're going to be watching a show? Does that mean we're going to be sleeping? You want a Pavlovian association. Bed is sleep, bed is sleep. Because then once you're in bed, you'll get to sleep faster and you'll get into deep sleep more readily. So there is a difference.
beautiful.
And you had a follow-up question.
I'm going to implement that. One last follow-up question. On Wednesdays, I need to wake up at 4:45 a.m. for the run club. When I drive to the beach and I have that run club and I spend a bit of time for myself going over my goals. That's what's been holding me back from setting up a consistent wake-up time. I didn't want to wake up 777, 4:45, 777. Or is that okay?
I think as one day out of the week, that should be okay. Yeah, I think that should be okay. I wouldn't wake up at 4:45 every day.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Stephen. The last two questions I always wrap up this podcast with all my guests is question one, any recent discoveries that you've been implementing to your day-to-day life? Or the last discovery that you've added to your day-to-day routine?
Last discovery that I've added to my day-to-day routine would be this. I have been taking a supplement called paraxanthine in the mornings. Paraxanthine is a metabolite of caffeine. And historically, I've been a big caffeine drinker. But the nice thing about paraxanthine is it is longer acting and smoother, less likely to be jittery, less likely to make one feel jittery, and doesn't have the same crash as caffeine. And so that is one recent thing that I've been implementing into my morning routine, some paraxanthine, and I found that to be helpful.
Follow-up question on that. I don't drink or consume caffeine. Am I missing out on a superpower, a free, risk-free drug? Because when I'm tired, I just take a nap or I push through. My always concern is I didn't want to become dependent on something, or
Yeah.
I'd be 90% efficient out of the 100, even though yeah.
Yeah. Caffeine comes with risks. You know, caffeine constricts blood flow to the brain. Caffeine is highly addictive, which is one reason that I've tried to move away from it some and use paraxanthine instead. If you can get by without anything, great, you know, but paraxanthine is a bit cleaner, you know, than caffeine would be.
Got it. The last question is, any personal goals over the next 6 months for you, Stephen, unwork related?
Unwork related. So that's a key there. Yes, a couple goals. One would be deepening the connection with my wife, who I love very much. And, you know, as you kind of spoke about earlier, how life goes through phases of the things that we really focus on, and, you know, sometimes to the detriment of other areas that are important to us. I think one big goal is to realign my own priorities and spend time in a way that matches what I really want. And so connecting more and going on more date nights would be one personal goal. It's easy to get away from date nights when you have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. So that would be my main goal.
I love that. Stephen, where can people get more of you?
Um, I post on Instagram pretty regularly. It's at Dr. Stephen Storage, Dr. Stephen Storage. I work at Amen Clinics, AMEN. So if anyone's ever interested in performing an evaluation or being seen, they can find me online at the Amen Clinics website. And those would be two great ways.
Stephen, thank you so much for your time. I learned so much. I wrote down so many questions that you sort of
Those are amazing notes.
each one would be, I'll write a box and then I'll cross it once I get to it. So I really appreciate your time. I learned so freaking much. I really appreciate, I know it's late over there. I know you've had a long day and this isn't easy. We went for, I think, 2 hours and 13 minutes now. So I really appreciate your time. You're super empathetic. I could feel the energy through the screen. So I just want to say thank you for this beautiful conversation.
Hey, it was great talking with you, Andy. I really like your energy, and I feel like I've gotten to know you through the questions you asked. So, great connecting, and yeah, keep me posted on, anything you need or when this airs or, all that good stuff. And I'll be happy to share on my channels as well.
Beautiful. Guys, if you made it this far, hopefully you guys had a blast listening to this episode. And I'll see you guys next week on another episode of the podcast. Peace. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Learned so freaking much. So thank you. I know it's late over there, so I'm appreciative of your time.
All right, Andy. Well, take care. Have a great rest of your day. It's already March where you are, right?
March 1st. Hope
right. Well,
you've made it to the end of the week, Friday night.
yes, that's right. And I've made it to going to bed now. But I'm not, unfortunately, I won't be following my own advice of not looking at a screen right before bed, but I think I'm exhausted enough that it's not going to matter tonight.
Thank you, Steve. I'll let you go. Have a beautiful week and I'll keep you updated.
All right. Take care, Andy. Great meeting you.
Likewise.
Bye.
Bye.